The arena lights had barely settled when the cameras found Dmitry Bivol standing beneath them, his expression as calm and unreadable as always, a man who seemed built not merely for boxing, but for quiet ritual pressure. On this night, he stepped into the ring not just as a contender, but as a WBA interim world champion, defending his status, his craft, and the poised composure that had already begun to define his early legacy. Across from him, a man cut not from grace and finesse, but from grit and brute persistence awaited the first bell. Robert Berridge, the New Zealander known simply as the Butcher. 32 years old, shorter, sturdier, a fighter who had seen enough battles to understand exactly what survival costs. He entered the ring from Auckland with a record of rugged experience, a frame built like the kind of fighter who never comes for spectacle, but always for the damage. The ring announcer's voice rolled through the hall with ceremonial weight, naming trainers, judges, supervisors, the German officials overseeing the match, and the stern referee Stanley Christodoulou, whose face already looked carved from something immovable. Bivol, fighting out of St. Petersburg, exuded the polished discipline of a man whose skill was not just learned but sharpened, refined, distilled into something almost mathematical. Yet behind all that method stood something even more human. Only days earlier, on the 17th of February, he had become a father for the second time. While most fighters talk about motivation and metaphors, fire in the heart, hunger in the gut, Bivol came into this match with something different. With the exhaustion of a new child and the glow of fresh joy still trailing behind him, he stepped under those bright lights with a quiet steadiness, as though this fight was simply another responsibility he had already accepted long before anyone asked. What no one could forget, however, was that his layoff had been long, marked by the slow, frustrating healing of a hand injury from his last outing in 2016. That downtime meant recovery, patience, and the constant hum of doubt that fills any athlete forced out of ring too long. Berridge, by coincidence or fate, had also been absent from competition for roughly the same stretch of months. Both men were returning to the stage they craved, both with the pressure of performance coiled inside them, and yet only one would be able to dictate the opening notes of the story unfolding between the ropes. The bell rang with the crisp finality of a starter pistol, and the first round began like many first rounds of great fighters do. Quiet, thoughtful, an examination instead of an assault. Bivol moved with that telltale economy that had always startled trainers and spectators alike. He wasted almost nothing, giving the impression of a man who could fight 12 rounds without ever shifting out a second gear. His footwork glided rather than stepped. His jab, though thrown sparingly in these early minutes, cracked like a tool deliberately placed rather than swung. The commentators remarked immediately on how efficiently he met Berridge's advances, stopping the New Zealander not with force but with timing. Berridge had said beforehand that Bivol would not break him quickly, that is, it was not a thing easily bent. But already he was dealing with a fighter who didn't so much break wills as redirect them until they snapped on their own. Still, Bivol approached the opening exchanges like a man remembering his body after injury. He didn't rush, didn't test a hand with reckless flurries. He relied instead on precision, sending single clean shots directly through the gaps in Berridge's guard. Every time Berridge inched forward, Bivol answered with a right hand that sounded too sharp to be casual, yet too relaxed to be desperate. Even the crowd seemed to settle into a quieter appreciation, murmuring only when Bivol found the mark with a shot that looked almost careless but landed with perfect accuracy. The fight felt like chess played by a man who already knew the endgame, but still entertained his opponent's hope for a few moves. And while that efficiency seemed simple to the untrained eye, those who understood the craft knew it was anything but. Bivol's sparring camps were known for rigor, filled with partners who pressed him harder in training than some opponents could during a fight. His preparation had taken place between Moscow and St. Petersburg, cities that carried their own traditions of old-school boxing discipline. Everyone close to his camp spoke of his desire not just to win but to grow, to face stronger, sharper rivals in 2017. His promoter promised him 4 fights that year, and Bivol had already made clear he wanted every one of them to be a step upward, not sideways. And so tonight, facing a man like Berridge, a respectable, durable, but ultimately mid-tier fighter, was less about spectacle and more about execution, patience, and announcing that the energy behind his rise had not dulled in the months he spent healing. As the round progressed, Berridge tried to close distance, tried to throw combinations that might disrupt the Russian's rhythm. But each time he lunged, his balance betrayed him. His punches came in crooked lines that Bivol saw long before they arrived, and the interim champion responded with simple counters that stood out for their clarity. One right hand split the guard so cleanly that Berridge's head snapped back even though Bivol had barely shifted his weight. Another sharp jab cut through the center and drew a murmur of appreciation from the crowd. It wasn't that Berridge lacked courage or grit. It was that Bivol seemed to operate at a level of technical purity that left no oxygen for chaos. By the second round, the rhythm had shifted in Bivol's favor with such ease that even the commentators sounded almost startled by the difference. They noted his precision, his ability to conserve energy without sacrificing aggression. Bivol wasn't a showman, but he wasn't dull either. He existed in that rare space where efficiency itself becomes a marvel to watch. His punches landed with a frequency approaching perfection. Sharp jabs, right hands through the middle, combinations thrown only when absolutely necessary. And while Berridge kept the kind of stoic posture one expects from a fighter nicknamed the Butcher, the truth was obvious. He was being carved apart piece by piece, not by brutality, but by the slow, relentless erosion of his defenses. Still, Berridge tried. He forced exchanges, threw looping shots, hoped for a moment where Bivol might misjudge, step wrong, or get greedy. But there is something profoundly defeating about fighting a man who never gives you even the smallest mistake to cling to. Every time Berridge lunged forward, Bivol slipped or pivoted, returning fire with startling clarity. Every time the New Zealander tried to throw more than one punch, he found himself smothered by timing rather than power. And when he attempted to back Bivol into the ropes, he discovered that his opponent did not need to retreat. He simply stood his ground, placed a jab directly between the hands, and shut the exchange down before it could begin. A moment of true drama arrived midway through the fight. Bivol landed a counter that made the commentators' voices jump, a clean shot that rattled Berridge enough to force the referee to take notice. The crowd responded instantly with applause, sensing the momentum swing from steady domination to something far more decisive. Bivol pressed forward with intent now, still controlled, still economical, but willing to let the fight accelerate. Another sharp right hand landed, and then a snapping jab, and soon the referee stepped in just long enough to issue a count. Berridge recovered, but the crack in his armor had finally appeared. What followed was a stretch of boxing that felt like watching a master craftsman complete the final strokes of design he had been sketching since the opening bell. Bivol's pressure increased, but not in wild surges. He simply tightened the ring around Berridge, cutting off angles, stepping slightly left or right to keep the New Zealander guessing, and landing punches that echoed louder with each clean connection. Berridge swung wider now, his arms drifting apart as fatigue and frustration blended into something dangerously close to desperation. His heart remained unbroken, but his defense had begun to crumble. The third round ended with Bivol landing yet another precise sequence, and though Berridge stayed on his feet, he looked as though he had begun to fight purely on instinct. In the corner, his team spoke rapidly,